Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving headfirst into what is really going on with honeybees, and it's more than just the save the bees headlines that you've been seeing. Beekeeping losses are rising and honey prices are unfortunately tanking, and something strange is happening inside our hives. Charles Linder just released an article in the American Bee Journal discussing what researchers have found to cause the massive bee die-off that wiped out 62% of the hives in the United States. So to give you guys a recap on what's been happening up to this point, this last January, beekeepers started pulling their hives out of wintering sheds or out of the south and loaded them up to be trucked over to California for what is known as the greatest pollination event in the world. Pollinating the almonds has become a critical piece for the beekeeping industry, as it offers the bees a chance to be able to bring in some fresh pollen and enjoy some nice, beautiful weather at a time when most of the United States is still either cold or is still experiencing a sort of winter in terms of any sort of resources that are available to them. So everything was business as usual until bee brokers started unloading the trucks to find, well, dead hives.
This might be one of the most interesting, disturbing, and puzzling stories to come along in a long time.
So this is what you call a dead hive?
Yep, empty box, no bees.
And we would go through them, and like some of them 80%, 90% would be dead or weak or really bad.
If we go back to the 1940s, 1950, we had about 6 million colonies of bees in the United States.
This is not a pleasant thing to talk about. Honestly, this is a sit in your car and eat a whole tube of Pringles kind of discussion.
In the past 6 years, we've lost somewhere between 4.5 million and 12 million colonies.
This is when alarm was raised all over social media with the worry that beekeepers couldn't fulfill their pollination contracts. This is the scary part, because 1/3 of the food in the United States is pollinated by honeybees, so they're pretty important. For almonds specifically, it was said that we were going to be about 400,000 hives short, leaving many orchards unpollinated. Now, a few months after the fact, it's starting to look more like we were 200,000 short, with many of the remaining hives being weaker on average than in seasons in past, or were weaker than what brokers and growers were really looking for. For those of you who don't know, a broker is a middleman between the beekeepers and the growers. They fill a vital niche market for beekeepers by placing hives on the orchards at a time when, really logistically, all beekeepers heading to California in February and in March to load and unload the bees would be actually very difficult. So brokers are very much needed in our industry. Nevertheless, there were some really big key players in the industry that were seeing losses as great as 80 to 90% of their entire operation, which is way beyond the typical 5 to 10% that they would normally see. Luckily, the USDA got involved pretty quickly in hopes of finding answers, so let's just get to it and figure out, why did this bee collapse happen? So first and foremost, one has to completely understand that good bees in January completely relies on the function of the fall treatment for those that are going into storage and the winter weather for any of the bees that are in the south. These are two completely separate scenarios and events, but they both lead to the same ending. So for those that were sent into storage, the fall pollen and nectar flow, coupled with a good mite and virus control, is absolutely critical in the late summer and early fall time. It's easy to blame Varroa Varroa is a mite that attaches herself to the honeybees and pretty much sucks the life out of them. We've had problems with them in the past, but for the most part, our industry really kind of has a handle on them at this point. We do need better mite treatments going forward to kind of help with that. But for the most part, we've been pretty good at keeping our mites under control. And that is exactly what you saw with some of these key players is they had their mites in control. But another thing that you have to remember too is that timing is absolutely critical. It is critical that a hive has their mites in control at a key point in the turnover of the hive. You can most definitely treat 2 weeks too late and still come out with collapsed colonies. As Charles puts it, sure, your November checks look great, but the September numbers truly are what is key. That being said, there were some beekeepers that did try to catch a late summer flow. So instead of throwing on mite treatments under their hives, they threw on honey supers instead. And a lot of this is because the beekeeping industry is really struggling right now, as most beekeepers are really kind of finding themselves in an economic crunch. But this was only part of the issue. Throughout most of America, the fall flow has become really unimpressive, I would say. Some places get too much rain, other places don't get enough rain, and in many parts of America, the pollen and nectar flows are changing dramatically because of some of the new herbicides that are being used. I made a video talking all about this a few weeks ago, so I will just link it up here in the corner if you want to check that out. And Charles did mention that those herbicides are affecting his neck of the woods, and it seems to be that only beekeepers are the ones that are realizing it, as our honey yields are starting to decrease and so are the health of our bees. But either way, poor nutrition in the fall does mean weak and dwindling colonies later in the year going into wintertime. And there were some beekeepers that were starting to raise the alarm bells back in November before all of this mess happened, as they said that the bees didn't quite look right going into the sheds. So the second part to the puzzle was for the bees in the south, from Florida all the way to Texas. They were hit by some cold snaps and some bad weather. This region has been strong for wintering for beekeepers, as it offers some natural pollen and good temperatures for the bees to grow. On the East Coast, there was no denying that the weather and the hurricanes that they experience will, of course, affect any of the forage and the flow that they could have gotten. But with some of the cold snaps and snow that we saw throughout the south this year, the bees really kind of hit a standstill, and they ended up losing about 2 to 3 weeks of a critical time when they needed to be building up and producing more brood. So when it came time for them to load up to the almonds, beekeepers knew that their hives wouldn't make grade if they sent them to California. And part 3 goes to the brokers that we talked about themselves. So brokering hives for the last few decades has been a no downside venture. So the saying went that broker as many bees as you possibly can, especially if you're making $20 to $50 per hive. So their goal was more and more and, well, you guessed it, more. As a result, many made promises to growers that they weren't necessarily capable of handling, which Charles says this perfectly. Make no mistake, when you promise to supply bees to a grower, contract or not, there is a fiduciary responsibility in place. That grower's livelihood is based on your commitment. So rewind to last fall time, brokers were beginning to cull beekeepers. They were getting rid of beekeepers off of their books that may have not performed well in the past. So say you had a year that you just didn't do as well, and maybe you didn't have as many good hives when you sent them to them. And honestly, brokers, they don't really show you any sympathy at all. So jump forward to 4 months later, and these brokers ended up being short on hives in order to fulfill their contracts. And last but not least, we have the new, or well, really new to us, I should say, virus that was detected in dying hives. In the video I released on the die-off with Randy Oliver, I'll link it up here if you haven't seen it. He described hives that it was like foragers would just vanish and leave nothing but brood to recover in their hives. Colonies failed to grow despite any sort of natural pollen or supplemental pollen that was coming into the hives. And really, these colonies started going backwards or sat at a standstill. So this mirrors exactly what the definition of CCD is today. But before we talk about the virus that was found in these dying colonies, let's talk further on some unintended consequences that we're now seeing. So the industry, like I keep saying, is really, really struggling. I mean, really all of agriculture is struggling right now. But if you don't have any bees, you don't really have anything else. And according to Linder, the U.S. beekeeping sector isn't just stagnant, but it's failing. One of the parts of our industry, really our entire pollination system, relies on its ability to pollinate the almonds in February. This leads to huge hives that are boiling over with bees that need to be split immediately before they swarm. And I say this because it's pretty well known now that pollination events on other crops, well, let's just say that you only want to pick up a couple pollination contracts if you want your hives to make it through wintertime. Pollination is very, very stressful on the bees. Some of the things that they're coming in contact while they're out in those fields and in the orchards, and having to move them around quite a bit too isn't really the best for them. So beekeepers are continuously having to replace their hives by splitting them and making new ones just to cover any of the losses that they are having and anticipate having. So say that beekeepers no longer got to pollinate the almonds. Well, the bees really wouldn't be able to split until later in the year, meaning that the early blooming fruits may not be able to get the bees that they need. Now, I say this because the news of the bee die-off has many growers really concerned about this next year's pollination. We have already seen some growers associations asking questions about our industry's ability to meet their needs in the upcoming season, and it honestly appears like we're not going to have any problems in that category. Beekeepers have been tirelessly splitting their hives and going into debt to buy new hives and more bees so that they can still make the numbers that their contracts require. So if there is a shortage, Linder says that it's most likely going to be in cranberries or blueberries just because of their low profit per hive and bee health. So the unintended consequence of all of this was that we sowed fear into the growers for really no reason. Growers have options for bumblebees, and mechanical pollination has begun to sound a little bit better for the growers. Mechanical pollination is not impossible, folks. It is impractical as it is not really cost effective, but that starts to sound a little bit better when that can be more reliable than the honeybees, if you get my drift. So the moment that the growers no longer believe that we are the best option, naturally, they're going to start looking for other options. And back in February, I chatted with the head of Blue Diamond Almonds, Mel Machado. Check out that video if you haven't seen it yet. And he said himself that self-fertile almond trees are here and they're being put into orchards right now. So if us beekeepers are no longer reliable and the almond farmers are still sitting on quite a bit of last year's crop, why not produce less and start replacing trees with the self-fertile variety? Now, I will say self-fertiles do still require bees, but instead of the usual 2 hives per acre, they're saying anywhere between half a hive to 1 hive per acre of self-fertiles. So, non-intended consequence number 2. It was a great year for pollination weather. The bees were able to get more flight time, and the weather was practically perfect as we didn't have a whole lot of rain come in, and it was sunny and warm almost every single day. So some growers may have actually been able to get decent crops even if they were short on bees. Now, there's no denying that they were probably piggybacking off of their neighbors, but still, say that these growers were still able to produce a good crop fully knowing that they were short on bees. Meanwhile, all of us beekeepers are running around like our hair is on fire, screaming at the top of our lungs. Of course, the growers are going to think, okay, if we could still make a good crop without having to have as many bees, then why don't we just not rent as many bees going into the future? And to give you a little backstory on the stocking rates of bees into almonds, they determine it based off of poor weather years. So just in case they were to have a bad year, they know that at least still they have enough bees to be able to pollinate everything, even if they're not getting the flight time that they really need. So, as Charles puts it, does a few $1,000,000 for the USDA for some research justify the further damaging of our industry? Solving CCD while simultaneously killing the demand is not a win. This is just the grower's view. But what about the politicians and the public? How many times do we have to do a Save the Bees campaign until the general consensus is, all right, so the bees are dying. Tell me something I don't know. So that being said, the bees dying this year really is not a big issue. And Charles talks about that from a research point of view, really the entire industry is very much behind. We aren't asking the right questions. Instead, we're asking the same questions, expecting different results. But what is the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing and expecting something different? For example, right now there are labs testing for pretty much all of the usual suspects. Every theory from some new pesticide to chemtrails is all being floated. We're looking into all known viruses that we do have. So really, what's next? Charles is almost certain that we will be told after the USDA compiles all of the research that there is really no smoking gun, that it all boils down to some unexplainable event leading to the mysterious CCD. So send us some more money, and next time you get a case of CCD or cash cow disease, call us and we'll be right out. So the $1,000,000 question is, who's going to take those results and turn them into answers? Who is the person to stand up and say it's X, Y, and Z, and here solutions are? Now, this leads me to what we suspect to be the culprit of this year's collapse. Keep in mind that this is based on what some of the smartest guys in the industry are seeing and finding in their research. And this is not just Linder guessing, but this is some of the info that he's sharing from the best. And is it the final answer? Well, that part is still a guess and remains to be confirmed. So let me read to you what Charles wrote word for word so we can fully grasp what he is saying here. All right, so we have the American Bee Journal. If you don't have a copy, I would definitely recommend subscribing because they have a lot of great updates in this. Okay. There is a new to us virus called the iridescent virus. Its technical name is wax moth IIV6 or iridovirus. I'll put it up on the screen because I cannot pronounce that word. So let me give you a little background on it, and it's not on the radar, but it is super important. Some of this may seem like weeds, but I will try to put it in layman's terms. It has taken me years to grasp it myself. There are really two types of viruses, RNA and DNA. When researchers in general look for these viruses, they do so with what is called a PCR primer. Each primer attaches itself to parts of the DNA and allows that part to be replicated and identified. The major problem with this is that the primers are very specific. Each one has to be developed for the virus you're looking for. One would ask why this matters. This is the real key to our future. Right now, we have labs cooking away looking for viruses we know about at record speed. And as an industry, we are waiting with bated breath for their answer. The problem is, they may only be looking for the things that we know about. Plugging in the unknown ones is quite a bit trickier. So back to the iridescent virus, a bit of history. It was found in samples collected in the first round of CCD. More on how is coming. It seems strongly related to comorbidities such as nosema. Comorbidities are things that aggravate each other, often in the point of death. The virus itself is actually a wax moth virus, which would quickly explain why we don't see wax moths hitting dead hives quickly, and proves a host to explain the gaps in prevalence. Honeybees are not usually the main host. I suspect since it's an insect virus, small hive beetle may also be suppressed by it. In extreme cases, it will iridescent the brood, but it is rare it gets to that point. It has been shown to kill adult bees, and a 2020 paper by Joe McKinnon's clearly shows it kills brood as well. So the go-to question here is, why the heck are we not talking about it? Good question. Verification is the last piece. Right now, some of the best are trying to do that, but there are problems. This virus is a real pain in the neck. Much like COVID, it keeps mutating. On top of that, it's what Dave Wick of BVS Testing Services refers to as a soft envelope virus, meaning it's easy to damage, so much so that you cannot see it properly. As such, finding a PCR primer in the virus itself is a moving target. It takes very special equipment to find it to begin with. So this equipment was developed for the military, and not all researchers accept the technology. Many of the current labs only have PCR as a tool. As such, they can only look for PCR primed processes. So, what is the option? How do we find viruses without PCR primers? Well, that is the key. A few years back, under the guise of battlefield warfare, a method was developed that is much different. I call it molecular sieve. Sieve? Sieve. Its real name is electrospray DMA, particle counter. When coupled with mass spectrometer, proteomics, it allows us to find many of the unknowns. Mass spectrometry based proteomics identifies and quantifies proteins and their modifications by measuring the mass-to-charge ratio ions in a gas phase, enabling comprehensive analysis of complex protein mixtures. So in simpler terms, it is looking for proteins that the virus creates. The whole process works in simple terms, much like a combine does. Grind up your material and run it through ESDMA to sort by a size. Each type of virus seems to have a particular size range. Over time, these size ranges can be sorted and identified. In this case, an unusual spike in one range is noted and through more work identified or named. So who are the guys behind this information? Dr. Jerry Bromenshank, Dave Wick, Charles Wick, and Joe McKinnon's have all done groundbreaking work on this. Charles Wick developed what was a classified method for detecting viruses. He and his brother were deeply involved. Dr. Bromenshank at the time was privy to what they were working on due to his work with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. Since the initial ID, it has been noted by Dennis Van Engelstorp and confirmed as deadly to bees by McKinnon's. We should be paying attention. So what is needed? Well, two things. First, some money. Dave Wick has equipment and is licensed to use it, but unfortunately his equipment needs a bit of updating and repair. I am currently trying to help find money to make that happen. Reach out if you have any sources. The target goal is $40,000. The second is from Dr. Bromenshank directly, and he says, we need samples. If history is correct, it is not over yet. Samples received by Dave Wick in Florence, Montana over recent weeks, just as in 2006 through 2010, have a variety of viruses, lots of noezema, and has been seeing iridescent rainbow particles in some of the samples. Anyone who still has crashing colonies need to get bees to BVS. Scott Debnam, I'm sorry if I pronounced your last name wrong, and I are trying to come up with a quick, inexpensive method for beekeepers to look for iridescent, other than blue or green larvae, which apparently only occurs in the most severely infected bees. What Scott and I need are freshly dead or dying bees. Almost all of the samples sent to Dave are badly decomposed. Dave says to gather fresh, dead, dying bees into a Ziploc, seal with air in the bag, and ship. Do not add frozen gels, dry ice, and with luck, we'll get live bees. I will put in the description below a link to get in contact with them and to get the address of where to send bees to if you want to do that. So if you send to Dave and pay his fee, he will look for viruses, noezema, and iridescent. If you don't want to do this, please contact me at beeresearch@aol.com. I'll give you my address and you can send living bees to Scott and me so that we can dissect and look for easy to see markers. It is impossible to look for biomarkers when the internal organs have turned into soup. If it wasn't for Dave Wick, who has the instruments that were used for our 2006 through 2010 study, we wouldn't know that the current crashing colonies have high viral loads, nosema, and iridescent particles that are likely IIV, the virus, but hard to extract, purify, and identify from decomposing samples. And again, there is no sampling plan. All we have is what Dave has received. So this gets us to the end, and the last need we as an industry really have to do better at. This is summarized by Dr. Bromenshank, so I will use his words, but he is 100% on target for what we need. You ready? Which brings me to my final comment. No one has established an appropriate protocol for properly sampling sick colonies on a year-to-year basis. One that has appropriate geographic stratification and provenance, history of samples, movements, treatments, or inspections. These are needed to conduct a true epidemiological study. We're always stuck with guesstimates of losses and grab samples from a crisis. So let's make it happen. So, bottom line, the beekeeping industry is in fact in trouble, but the solution isn't more panic. It's smarter science, clear communication, and acknowledging new threats like iridescent virus. Charles Linder might be controversial, but honest conversations like this might be exactly what we need. So if you found this video helpful, please feel free to hit the like button or subscribe, and also drop a comment. If you are a beekeeper or even just work in ag, I would love to chat about what are you seeing out there. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.